All right, so this week we are in week 2 of love handles. If you know, last week we kicked off this series talking about love handles, not these love handles, right? But love handles, okay? So I've seen to acquire these since I turned 40, and it's awesome. But we're talking about a different kind of love handle, right? We're talking about being able to put some handles in our relationships and on our relationships so that we have something to move forward with, something to hold on to, something that we can grip. And so last week I talked to you guys specifically for those of us in the room that were married. We talked about marriage. And I told you that I spoke to you from Ephesians chapter 5, and I told you what Paul's version, or what Paul had to say about how a husband should love his wife and how a wife should love her husband. And we looked at it from that idea, but I gave you 4 ideas to a great marriage. We talked about how communication was an important piece and how communication was really important. We talked about how a couple has to be on the same page financially. We talked about how a couple has to have fun together. And then I talked about the idea that a couple has to have grace, that there has to be grace in our marriages. If there's not grace in our marriages, we're going to have a really hard time. But at the end of the day, I said, hey, let's just love each other the way that Christ loves us. And so today we're going to switch gears a little bit. Last week we talked about marriage. Today I want to speak to all the single people in the room, right? And so we're going to talk about the world of dating and what that looks like. And some of us that are married have kids that are moving in that direction and have teenage girls that like boys for whatever reason and make my skin crawl and all that good stuff, right? And so I've been telling, if you don't know, I have 4 girls. And so I've told all my girls that boys are stupid, so don't waste your time till like they're 50. And so, but today we're going to talk about dating. And then next week we got something special for you guys. But in the world of dating and trying to give you guys that are in that world, or if we have kids that are going to be heading into that world, parents, listen up, because we can use this for our kids as well, that I want to give some love handles to that group of people. And so this morning, let's talk about the word for a few minutes, the word obsessed. Obsessed is an interesting word because it's something that we use a lot in our society. It's something that you hear quite a bit. Man, I'm obsessed to this, or I'm obsessed by this video game, or I'm obsessed by this restaurant, or I love this, or I can't get enough of that. And so we talk about the word obsessed, and we can use it for all sorts of things. Food and clothes and movies and people and music. And if I give you a list, there's several things. I don't know that I'm obsessed by them, but I might be. That there's certain things that I don't know that my life would be complete without. There's certain things that I have to do. There's certain things that I have to have. And I'm sure if you think about it, there's some things in your world that you are obsessed with as well. Just a couple weeks ago, there was the Super Bowl, and for some reason, I don't know why, whether I'm hungry or not hungry, it's probably why I have love handles, but, right, whether I'm hungry or not hungry, watching football, I got to eat chips and salsa, right? So go watch the football game, got to have chips and salsa to be able to watch the football game. Kind of obsessed with that idea that that's something that I have to have and something that we got to do. And so when we talk about the word obsessed, and I ask you the question, maybe what are you obsessed with right now? All of us are probably obsessed with something, and you can probably come up with an answer pretty quickly. But for those of us that are in this world, are you obsessed by dating? Is dating something that you're obsessed by? Was that one of your answers? Are you obsessed with who you're dating, or if you're dating, or when you'll be dating someone new? Let me say that again. Are you obsessed with who you're dating, or if you're dating, or when you'll date someone new? For some of you, you're obsessed with a certain guy or girl who may not even know your name, right? You may be obsessed with a girl or a guy, and you just wish that you had somebody to hang out with on Friday nights, and you wish that you had someone to text during the day, and you wish that there's just somebody that you just can't stop thinking about. The good thing in that idea is that's the good news in all of this, is that's normal. That if that's something that you want, that it's normal, that dating is exciting, it's thrilling, it's dramatic, it's fun, right? But maybe you've noticed this about yourself when you were dating, or if you're dating, or maybe your friends that have dated or are dating, that sometimes dating starts to change us. And we begin to change. And we begin to become somebody different because of the person that we're dating. And change isn't always a bad thing. I know some of you are opposed to change and some of you don't like change. And if everything just stayed the same, I would be okay in every aspect of my life. Some of you are like, let's just change everything all the time, right? And some of us are in the middle. Change isn't always a bad thing, but we've all seen it, right? I mean, maybe you did it, maybe you've done it, or you're doing it now, maybe you've seen somebody do it. Like you start to find someone that you like or someone that you feel maybe attracted to or a connection with, and maybe they're into some things that you're not into, or maybe they listen to something that you don't listen to, or they watch something that you don't watch, or whatever, and you just kind of begin to change who you are so that that person will like you or will continue to like you. I mean, sometimes you might discover some movies that you've never really watched before that maybe you like, or a different genre of music that you've never listened to that person listens to, or maybe they open your eyes to some things that you hadn't seen, and change can be a good thing, but it's not always a good thing. Being in student ministry for as long as I watched girls and guys alike change themselves for who they were because they had in their mindset that they had to have a boyfriend or they had to have a girlfriend, that their life was incomplete without the opposite sex in their life. And so they would do things, say things, and change themselves so that this boy or this girl would like them. And when we find ourselves in that situation, that becomes a problem. That when we begin to change who we are, it's like you're almost a shapeshifter and you're morphing into a different person just because of who you're with. That becomes a problem, and we've all seen it happen. You've got this person who is sure of their identity, sure of themselves, sure of the plan that God has for them, sure of the direction they're headed, sure of everything that they want to accomplish in life. Enter boy or girl that changes their life forever, and now what was their target is no longer their target, and all of that has changed, and now their eyes and their focus are on something else other than what they were initially focused on, because this boy or this girl changes their mind, their direction, and their target. And when we start to change our targets, when things start to change a little bit, all of a sudden the things that we were focused on, now our only target becomes the relationship itself. And when the relationship itself, man, I know I probably shouldn't do this. I know I probably shouldn't watch that. I know I probably shouldn't go there. I probably shouldn't do this. I probably shouldn't do that. But man, I really like him. I really like her. And so I'm going to change the direction that I'm headed. I'm going to change the way that I'm thinking, because the only thing I really want in my life is to make sure that this relationship works. Regardless of whether you're 13 or 80, somewhere in between that, we've all had those thoughts, and we've all had probably that happen in our world. And so the relationship becomes the target, but here's the problem. That when we're seeking after that type of relationship, or when the relationship becomes our only target, we stop thinking. And when we stop thinking, bad things happen. We want to become what someone wants us to be. Right? Have you ever done that? Like somebody wants you to be something different or do something different than you normally would do. And so we become what someone wants us to be. Or we become what we think we should be in order to keep the person that we're with. Well, if you're going to be with me, if we're going to be in this relationship, then you've got to do this, whatever this is, right? You've got to, we've either got to be intimate, there's got to be physical side of it, or you've got to watch this, or you've got to go here, or you're going to go there with me, or you're going to do this, you're going to do this. Like if you want to be with me, and so we start to change who we are in order to keep the person that we're with. And then the other thing, and why it becomes such a problem, is because we stop using good judgment. All of these behaviors are a symptom of obsession. Maybe you've done it. Maybe we've seen friends do it. I know at some point in my life years ago, I was guilty of it. And in the end, we end up in this really bad place because we've stopped paying attention to who we really are and what's best for us and where we ought to be going. And we become obsessed, and we move our target. And here's the idea, okay? That in our attempt to find the right person, we become the wrong person. That in our attempt to find the right person, we become the wrong person. our culture tells us that if you try hard enough and do hard enough and do this and do that and do this, that there is Mr. Right is out there, right? Or Mrs. Right is out there. That the right person for you is there. And we spend most of our dating lives trying to find the right person instead of becoming the right person. And so because we're always in a search to find the right person, all of a sudden we sometimes become the wrong person because we change who we are and we change what we're about and we change what our target was on. How many stories through youth ministry, to pick on the teenagers for just a moment, of the girl who was focused on college and a full ride scholarship and this and that and whatever she had in front of her, and her whole life was planned, and her parents went to church and she had made this vow that she wasn't going to have sex before marriage and she was only going to do this and this is what it was going to be. And then she meets Mr. Right and he says all the right things and he doesn't share the same beliefs as she shares, and he shares one thing and he says one thing, and well, if you love me, this will happen, and I love you. And next thing you know, she finds herself taking her eyes off of her target. She finds her eyes on him, and she finds herself going down a path that she wishes she had never gone down. And then that path is full of regret and mistakes and remorse and all these things. Or flip it around. The guys have the same thing. It happens. Well, if you really love me, you wouldn't go all the way to there to go to college. You would just stay here. Plans change. Things change. And so often in our search to try to find the right person, we often become the wrong person in our dating lives. And historically speaking, dating is kind of a fairly new idea. When you think about it in the context of the Bible, right? Mary and Joseph, who are Jesus' parents, they weren't hanging out at Starbucks, right? They weren't texting each other all night long, cheesy texts. They weren't going to the movies together. Like, dating is a fairly new idea. But the idea of obsessing over someone isn't new at all. And so today, as we look in the scriptures, it may be a story that you've heard of before. It may be a story that you don't have any familiarity with at all, but it's a story of a guy who was a little bit obsessed. It's a story in the Old Testament from the book of Judges, which takes place in a really important time in the country that this guy's from, in Israel. The Israelites were finally their own nation under the leadership of Moses and then later Joshua. And as Joshua's life came to an end, God gave the Israelites judges to rule over them. They didn't have a king. They had judges. And the judges would determine what was right and what was wrong and would make decisions, and then the military would enact on those decisions. And so we're in the book of Judges today. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We're going to be in Judges chapter 16. And so the guy that we're going to talk about today is this guy named Samson. Samson was one of the judges. And according to the Bible, Samson was given this supernatural strength from God, if you're familiar with the story. There's a movie coming out. I don't know if you've seen the previews for it. There's a movie coming out about it. And I'll be honest, as a pastor, I'm always a little bit apprehensive when these biblical movies come out because I'm not really sure how biblically accurate they're going to be. And for people that don't normally go to church and then they show up and they see the movie of Samson, like people went and saw Noah with Russell Crowe and they're like, did the rocks really talk? And we're like, no, that's not in the Bible, right? No, really? That was really cool. Well, I wish it happened, but it doesn't say, it may have, but it doesn't say anything in Scripture. So I don't know how accurate Samson's movie is going to be, but it does look pretty cool for those of you that like action flicks, right? And so we're going to talk about this guy Samson. He was one of the judges, and according to the Bible, he was given this supernatural strength, but there was some parameters that were put on his life. Don't cut your hair, don't do this, don't eat that, do this, live your life a certain way. If you handle yourself this, if you do certain things in your life, which you can read in Judges chapter 13, if you follow these certain parameters for your life, then you will always have this supernatural strength. But Samson had a weakness. His weakness was the ladies, okay? Samson had a weakness, and it was the ladies. And so this morning, regardless of where we may be in our walk with Christ, where we may be in our belief of God and our belief of what the Scriptures have to say, I believe that Samson's story would be helpful for us and in our dating lives. And so I want you guys to listen to this. So we're going to be In Judges chapter 16, I always tell, not always, but most of the time I'll give you guys, hey, look, if you don't have something to read this week, if you're like, hey, I don't really know what to read this week in my Bible, I don't really have a devotion time or something that I'm doing, you need something to read, go read Judges 13 through 15 and get the backstory to who Samson is, what Samson's life was all about, and some of the things that happened in his life. It's a crazy story. Because I don't have time to go through all of it this morning, but we're going to pick up in chapter 16. And so let's begin reading in verse 1. It says, Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here, and they surrounded the place, and they set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of morning, and then we will kill him. But Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and he pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in the front of Hebron. And after this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and will be like any other man. And then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches fire, and so the secret of his strength was not known. So let me just set up a little bit of what's happening here. Samson has this supernatural strength. And you find out later, or if you read chapters 13 through 15, you will find out that his strength lies in his hair. Like as long as his hair doesn't get cut, which is kind of funny that this is where it lies, but this is how God set things up. That his strength lies in his hair. So as long as his hair is long and flowing and awesome, right, then he's good. But if his hair gets cut, he becomes weak. He becomes like every other man. And if you read chapters 13 through 15, like I challenge you to do this week, you'll see why the Philistines, who were the enemies of the Israelites, is two people who don't really like each other very much. And Samson seems to have a thing for Philistine women. So instead of falling in love with an Israelite, he's falling in love with the enemy. So it's like, it doesn't make any sense. And so earlier in his story, he tells his parents, hey, I really like this Philistine woman. Go get her for me. And they're like, but she's a woman of the enemy. Like we don't get along too well with the Philistines. And he's like, that's okay. Just I want her. Go get her for me. I'm obsessed with her. I need her and I want her. And so his parents goes and gets her, and they have a relationship, and they form a relationship, and some kind of weird things happen, and then he's no longer with her. And then we pick up, and then he kills all these Philistines, and he kills them with the jawbone of a donkey and all this crazy thing. Like he takes out like 1,000 men by himself. That's a bad dude, in case you don't know. I've never killed 1,000 people by myself, just saying. And so he's wanted by the Philistines, right? He's wanted by them because he's an enemy to them. And so when he falls in love with Delilah, the people approach Delilah and they say, hey, listen, we'll give you 1,100 pieces of silver each. And it doesn't tell us how many people were there, but I'm going to guess she was going to be sitting pretty good after this whole thing was over, right? If you can just find out what his weakness is, if you can just find out what Samson's weakness is so that we can take him out, so that we can bind him up, so that we can arrest him, so that we can kill him, whatever it is. Like he's killed so many of our people. He's done so much harm to us. Just we'll give you all this money if you'll just find out what his weakness is. And so she goes to Samson and she asks him, what is your weakness? And he tells her a story. Well, if you bind me up with these cords and these bowstrings that haven't been dried and all these things, and she does exactly that. And then when the people come in to try to get him, he breaks it and he does what he does. And Samson is feeling a little bit like Delilah's done him wrong. Like Delilah's taken advantage of him. And so let's keep reading in verse 10. And then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If they bind me with the new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." And so Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. And then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If you were to weave the 7 locks of my head with a web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." And so while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into a web, and she made them tight with a pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin and the loom and the web. And then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day after day, and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart, and he said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb, and if my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." So Samson keeps playing this game with Delilah a little bit. Like, he understands where his strength lies. He knows where his strength is, where God gives him this supernatural strength. He knows where it comes from. But he also knows that he's not to tell anybody where his strength comes from. And so he tells her the bowstrings, and then he tells her, "Tie me with these ropes," and he tells her this, and he tells her that, and he kind of changes things up a little bit to kind of continue to see what's happening. And each time Delilah does what he says, and it doesn't work, and then she goes, "You've mocked me, you lied to me, you've told me all these things. Like, if you loved me, where your heart would be with me. Like, why do you keep lying to me?" And the scriptures tell us that she just keeps pressing and pressing and pressing and pressing. Nagging and nagging and nagging and nagging. And to the point that Samson finally breaks down and he tells her what his strength is. Later his head is shaved and he loses his strength, and the story goes on, and you can continue to read in chapter 16 this week if you need something to read. And see how the story ends. And if you're listening to this and you're wondering kind of, well, what was Samson's problem? Like, Delilah just seems manipulative. She just seems like she's kind of just nagging him all the time. Like, the solution seems simple enough to us, right? That Samson would just get up and leave. That Samson would be like, "Each time I've told you and you're trying to find out my strength so that you can take advantage of me, you're doing me wrong." And so that Samson would just get up and kind of leave the situation. Ever seen somebody in a bad relationship but yet they stay? Because they want to be with that person. They're obsessed with that person. They're with somebody that they know they shouldn't be with, but there's something happening there. I mean, it seems simple enough, but it was more complicated than that. Why? Because Samson was obsessed. He was so wrapped up in the girl that he didn't know what he would do without her. And when we think about it in the context of dating for us, is most like people who are obsessed with a person or like a relationship, the first thing to go was Samson's good judgment. Samson stopped thinking. He was driven by his emotions and not his logic, and so Samson kind of lost perspective. Ever met anybody in a new relationship that is completely driven by their emotions? Whew, man, he is so amazing. He is so awesome. She's so beautiful. She's so great. I can't believe this. And then 2 weeks later, it fizzles out, right? He's not what she thought. She's not what he thought. Maybe some things happen in 2 weeks, and now there's a series of regrets. People are so often when we fall in love, that we're driven by our emotions and we stop thinking. And so in his obsession, he gave in to please Delilah. The target of Samson's life moved from ruling well as a judge and what his strength was and what he should be, his target moved from what he was called to do to who he wanted to please. And so he shares with Delilah, and Delilah betrays him, and as a result, he's later captured and bound. He's tied to these 2 pillars in the temple courtyard, where eventually he would die among thousands of the Philistines. Like, if you don't know the story, like, his eyes are gouged out and he's blind and he's tied to these 2 pillars, and he just asks for enough strength, and he pulls the pillars and the whole place falls down and the roof caves in on everybody. All of that happens in his life because he lost perspective. He stopped thinking. And so Samson's story is a little bit depressing because we see this guy with the potential to rule, with all this potential, that the world ended up ruining his life because he stopped thinking, that his obsession didn't just hurt him in the moment, but it ended up destroying of what he could have been. And so what does it have to do with us? For those of us that are in the room in the dating scene or will be in the dating scene soon, please listen to this. What does Samson's story have to do with us? If we can learn anything from his story, it isn't that we should stay away from girls or that we should stay away from guys, but the point of what I'm trying to get to today is we talk about giving you some love handles in your dating relationships, just like we gave you love handles in your marriages last week, is that thinking is greater than dating. That thinking is greater than dating. I mean, in other words, dating is great, right? At a time in my life, I was a big fan of dating, right? I love to date my wife now, but like in a time in my life, like dating was cool. I was a big fan of it. It isn't in itself, it's not a bad idea. It isn't going to lead you dying in the hand of the Philistines, right? But dating is only as good as your brain will allow it to be. Dating is only as good as your brain will allow it to be. That once your thinking takes a back seat, then you're in trouble. Our thinking should always trump our obsession. Thinking should win every time. That thinking is greater than dating, because when we stop thinking, then we, like Samson, lose sight of one of the big ideas, and one of the big ideas is that God has a plan for you. And so often when the target in our life moves, and we take our eyes off of what God has for us because we're focused on him or focused on her, in the search for the right person, we sometimes become the wrong person. And we forget that God has a plan for us. That Ephesians 2:10 tells us that you were created in God's workmanship. That you were created to be his masterpiece. To do a good work that he planned in advance for you. Like, that's one of probably my life verse, and the idea to think that God has a plan for you. That you were created for something great. But so often we take our eyes off of what God has for us because we focus it on him or we focus it on her, and we lose sight of where we should be, and we stop thinking. And you've probably heard it, and especially for those of you that have been around me, you've heard it 1,000 times, that God has a plan for you. And so it almost starts to fall on deaf ears at some point. It's not that impressive of a statement as it used to be, but let me tell you again, God has a plan for you, just you. That he has something special for you, that his purpose for you doesn't depend on who you're dating or who you would like to date. God just has a plan for you. God's purpose for you is unique to you. Your purpose isn't your friend's purpose. Your purpose isn't your family's purpose. Your purpose isn't your boyfriend or your girlfriend's purpose. Like, your purpose is your purpose, and God set that aside for you. So when we think about this idea that God's made us, that God has something in mind for us, and that when we move our target from what God has for us and the plan that God has for us in our relationships, then we start to miss out on that plan. But the good news is that as many times as Samson lost sight of his purpose that God had for him, God never gave up on Samson. God heard him, and he still used him to do great things. But I don't know about you, but like me, when I read Samson's story, I can't help wonder what could have been. You ever seen anybody that got lost in a relationship or got lost in something and their life takes a tragic turn for the worse, and maybe things didn't work out the way that they thought that it would, and you're just like, man, what could have been? Like, what could have happened? Like, I can't help read Samson's story, but think about what could have been with his life if he hadn't been so obsessed with Delilah, if he had just been focused on what God has for him. But as we start to kind of figure out what does it look like for us, what does it look like in the dating world for those of us that are in that world, we get a chance to kind of figure it out. We get a chance to act on it. And Samson missed the chance to do that. And so we talk about today that dating is great, but thinking is better, right? Dating is great, but thinking is better. And I got 3 areas really quickly that I believe that we can start to think in. The first one is this, is that we've got to think about why you date. Think about why you date. I mean, what's your purpose? What is your purpose in dating? Dating is fun, it's good, but it won't be fun or good if you have the wrong purpose for it. It's a way to move up the social ladder. It's a way to ignore self-esteem issues, to make yourself look good around other guys or other girls. It's a way to learn how to get to know someone, to have some fun. Like, think about why you date. What's the purpose of it? The second thing is think about who you date. Think about who you date. I mean, it's tempting to want to go out with the first guy or girl who asks you because it kind of boosts your self-image, right? I mean, it's tempting to ask out the girl who you know won't say no because you can't handle rejection otherwise, right? Some of us have asked and asked and asked and get rejected and rejected and rejected, and then all of a sudden we're like, man, what's wrong with us? But it's really smart to be picky when it comes to dating. It will save you a lot of trouble in the long run. One of the things that Kim and I used to do for our students is we would go in our youth ministry days is we would have them go through and make a list of qualifications or certain things that they looked for in a future spouse or in a future date. And it couldn't be anything physical. That she couldn't be like, the guy's couldn't be like brown hair, blue eyes, right? She's got to have this. She's got to have that, right? I need this feature and that feature. He's got to have blonde hair and blue eyes, and he's got to work out, and he's got, it can't be any of that. Like, his arms have to be bigger than my legs. Like, it can't be anything like that, right? Can't be anything physical. It's just got to be attributes. Here's the word I'm looking for. Attributes that you are looking for in a relationship, and it can't be anything physical. And then we tell them, go home and stick it on your mirror and put it on your mirror. And every time that someone asks you out or you think you're about to ask someone out, then you look at those attributes and go, does he or she have these certain things? Well, they got 2 of them, so maybe I'll compromise. No, maybe I shouldn't. And we're like, if they don't meet the attributes that you're looking for, why would you go down that path? Why would you go down that road? I mean, yeah, everybody wants to be in a relationship. I mean, we all desire it, right? I mean, that's why Say Yes to the Dress is such a popular show. Most of the people who watch it aren't even married, right? And so you got all these shows that are popular. All these shows that are popular. I mean, we all desire to have some form of a relationship. We all want that, but we got to think about who we date. Think about who you date. And then the third thing is think while you date. When you finally get the girl or the guy of your dreams, the guy or the girl that you've been crushing to go on a date with for a really long time, when you finally get that chance to go out on that date, it's not the time for us to just turn our brains off and go, man, he finally asked me, we're going to dinner and a movie, or he asked me and we're going here, or we're going to this concert, or we're going there, we're going here, or she asked me, or I asked her and she said yes, and this is where we're headed. Like, once we get the date, we can't just turn our brains off and quit thinking about what we're supposed to be doing. Ask yourself if there are things that are healthy in your life. Are you healthy emotionally? Are you healthy physically? How much of your brain time is devoted to obsessing over this person? Even if he or she may be a great person, but is the relationship great for you now? So we got to think about why you date. You got to think about who you date, and you got to think while you date. And I believe that the best way for us to do that is for us to invite God into this process. That it doesn't have, our dating lives don't have to be a place that we shut God out. Because like we talk about often, about following Christ with our lives and giving Christ all of our lives, that we can't put everything in compartments to say, hey, listen, God, you can have this part of my life and this part of my life and this part of my life, but you can't have this. You can't have my finances because, I just handle my money on my own. You can't have this part of my life, or for those of us, hey, God, I'll follow you with my life, but I don't need you involved in my dating life because, man, she looks good. Or he looks good. So I'll handle the dating side of my life, Lord. God, you can have everything else. That we've got to invite God into that process. Samson lost sight of that. He lost sight of what God had for him and what God desired for him, and his eyes were only on Delilah, and it didn't end very well. So it doesn't have to be an area in our life where we shut God out because it feels too weird to talk about our dating life with him. I promise you this, that God is interested in that part of your life. Why? Because he loves you and he has a plan for you, and he already knows the decisions that you're going to make anyways, which is kind of scary, right? He already knows where you're going. He already knows the decisions that you're making. So let's just ask him for his help in how to make wise decisions. Because dating is great, but thinking is better. So as we head out here in a few minutes, for those of us that are in the dating world, I want you to kind of start to think about where you are when it comes to dating and being obsessed. Who or what determines the way that you think about yourself? That so often we find our identity in the person that we're with or the person that we're seeking after. My identity is in him. My identity is in her, which is a huge mistake because your identity is in God and how he designed you and what he desires for you. And so when we're down on ourselves and we don't think that we're worthy, or we're not feeling very good about ourselves, you can understand and know that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. That God has a plan for you and that he loves you. And that he cares for you. And we can't find our self-image in the boy or the girl that we're trying to date. We got to find that in Christ. But as we begin to date, as we begin to go down that road, we're going to invite God into the process. As you think about the person that you want to date, as you think about the person that you desire to have this relationship with, is it healthy thinking? Do you find yourself thinking some things that you know you probably shouldn't be thinking? Are you sending some text messages that you know you shouldn't send? Are you having some conversations that you know you shouldn't have? So often we have our eyes on the target. We know exactly what the target is. We know exactly where we're supposed to go. And he or she throws us off the target and we find ourselves going down a path that we know that we shouldn't be going down. The hope is that in this series we can give you some love handles so that you can stay focused on the target. We want you to have great marriages. We want God to be in the center of our marriages. If you're dating, we want you to have great dating relationships, but we want God to be in the center of that. Whether you're married or single, we want God in the center of your lives. It's what we desire for you. It's what he wants for you. Because he loves you and he has a plan for you. Samson took his eye off the target and lost track. And so let me ask you to close your eyes and bow your heads this morning.